I'm very, very happy to be here tonight, and thank you all for coming out. When we first discussed this a while ago, and came up with the title and the topic, Foreign Policy in the Age of Twitter, we talked it through some, but tonight I feel like I need to start by telling you that I recently canceled my Twitter account. It was not a big loss for anybody. Is that a loss? Have other people canceled? Oh, sorry. Is that from the microphone? Okay. Anyway, me leaving Twitter was not a big loss for anybody. I didn't have many followers, and I didn't follow many people. And, to be honest, I never really got Twitter. Even though I teach at a school where every single student who comes in is told, you must be on Twitter. Our students are also told Twitter can be an important tool in your reporting. Well, yes it can, but only if you are as rigorously skeptical of everything that you see on Twitter as you are of any other information that you gather as a reporter. We teach that necessary skepticism too, along with the techniques of how to check the authenticity of what's been posted on social media, to verify that it's posted by a real person, not a bot, and is that person who he says he is, and is he or she really at the site of the news event that's being portrayed, and is that a real picture from the event, and so on and so on. It's not an easy process to verify what you're seeing and reading on social media these days. And when I sit in on one of these verification workshops that we do for students, I feel frankly relieved that I am no longer out there as a daily reporter. Technology makes many parts of the job much easier for my students than it was in my day, but at the same time it brings new and very complex challenges to journalism. But back to my Twitter account and why I canceled it. The trigger for me was a story that I'm sure many of you read in the New York Times recently called The Follower Factory. It's the one that lifted the curtain on a hidden but very lucrative business that lets you buy Twitter followers for really not very much money. Let's say you've got 100,000 followers on Twitter, and someone else in your field has 200,000. Well, for about a penny a follower, you can quickly eclipse your competition, and then presto, everyone is going to think that you are now the leading expert. Maybe, that's the theory anyway. The New York Times tested this by paying $250 and getting 25,000 followers for its investment. Only some of them were actually real people, but it did boost that number of followers on the Twitter account. So why do people want to do this? Well, as I just said, maybe you want to bolster your image as an expert, a leading expert in whatever your field is. Maybe you're an entertainer or an entrepreneur. As the New York Times put it, your virtual status, like how many Facebook friends you have, how many Twitter followers, that may help you get a job, or it might determine how much you get paid for bookings or endorsements, or even how potential customers evaluate your business or your product. Then there's this strange new occupation called influencers. The Times describes them as amateur tastemakers, or YouTube stars who collectively, apparently, earn billions of dollars each year from advertisers. The more people an influencer reaches, the more advertising money they can make. The Times cites Captivate, a company that connects influencers with brands, and it says that if you have 100,000 followers, you could earn an average of $2,000 for a promotional tweet. Boost your following up to 1 million, and you might be getting $20,000 for an influential tweet. Anybody out there ready to quit their day job? I read these revelations in The Follower Factory around the same time that I read another really important analysis from Charlie Warzel. I don't know if any of you read Charlie. He writes for BuzzFeed, and he's the guy who first revealed that so many of the fake Facebook and Twitter accounts purveying misinformation in the 2016 election were run by teenagers in Macedonia. Some of those teenagers made a ton of money with their social media scams. And Charlie Warzel untangled these Macedonian schemes with some tech investigating that I couldn't do because it's not something that I learned to do, but our new journalism students are learning a lot of the techniques that Charlie used. There was also a lot of old-fashioned shoe leather journalism in his reporting. Charlie Warzel went to Macedonia. He met some of the teenage entrepreneurs there and tracked down the guy who taught them all how to set up fake sites and send out fake news and turn that into money. So what was the motive of these kids in Macedonia? You know, we're all familiar to some degree with the Russian influence efforts in 2016's election. Russia was said to be motivated by the Kremlin's desire to elect Donald Trump, or even if they didn't succeed with that, at least to sow confusion and make us all maybe even more bitterly partisan than we've become, and to build distrust of American institutions, and in particular maybe mainstream American media. None of that stuff that we know about the motives of Russia was on the minds of the Macedonian teenagers, according to Charlie Warzel. One of them said to him, "In Macedonia, our economy is very weak and teenagers are not allowed to work, so we need to find some creative ways to make money." They made money by creating fake sites or Facebook pages and filling them with aggregated or plagiarized posts. They weren't making up the stuff themselves. They were lifting it from fringe and right-wing sites right here in the US. They would find a good clickbait story, write a sensational headline, and post that on their phony website. And then they'd share that on their fake Facebook pages and Twitter accounts to try to generate traffic that would come back to the phony story on the phony website. The more that people clicked through to their sites, the more money, of course, they would earn from advertisers. Why were they posting pro-Trump and anti-Clinton messages? Again, nothing to do with politics at all. The Macedonians said they had tried posting some pro-Bernie Sanders material, you know, and some left-leaning stories, but those didn't get nearly as much traffic as the stories that favored Trump and did not favor Hillary, let's put it that way. They made more money posting about Trump and Clinton, and most of their most popular posts, according to BuzzFeed, were actually false or misleading stories. So before I took you on that little side trip to Macedonia, I mentioned some important recent analysis that Charlie Warzel wrote. I read this just after I'd started questioning, why am I still on Twitter? Here's what Warzel wrote a few weeks ago that made such an impression on me. Twitter and the other big social platforms have billed themselves and profited greatly, he said, as real-time windows into the world. And while no one's claiming the entire social web is a flimsy scam, the last few months suggest that we should perhaps be thinking of them less as windows and more as funhouse mirrors. That's the phrase that really stuck with me. We should perhaps be thinking of Twitter and other social platforms less as windows into genuine public opinion and more as funhouse mirrors. I read that, looked up online, of course, how to cancel my Twitter account, followed the instructions, and I'm gone from Twitter. I could stop right here, I suppose, and say, hey, follow me, go cancel your account, and to that funhouse mirror, and get all your friends to cancel too, and who knows, maybe we could really get something started. But the reality, of course, is that Twitter's bigger than all of us. Donald Trump certainly knows that, and he uses it sometimes masterfully. As a journalist, I'm particularly interested in how Trump uses Twitter to control the news agenda. Morning after morning, I wake up to NPR and the headlines often start with the latest tweets from Trump. And then over there on cable news, you've got hosts changing every hour or so, and they have often a very partisan lineup of guests who will talk all day about that tweet or tweets that Trump put out that morning. They analyze, they repeat, they parse every bit of meaning out of every last character in Trump's tweets at the expense of telling us about other news that's happening all over the world, but sadly I think is getting drowned out very often by the president's Twitter account. Kyle Pope, who's one of my colleagues, is an editor at Columbia Journalism Review, which is housed at the journalism school. Kyle recently wrote that in their obsession with Trump's tweets, journalists far too often let the president become essentially their assignment editor. The president posts early in the morning before newsrooms are really fully up and running for the day. And he posts provocatively, grabbing eyeballs and luring in reporters who dutifully report what the president said on Twitter this morning, although, as Kyle Pope put it, there's often this kind of subtle undertone in the way it's presented by the media. Isn't it outrageous that a sitting president would take time out of his day to dream this up? So enough already, said the CJR editor. Okay, Trump has every right to tweet, he says, but journalists have a responsibility to apply sound news judgment in selecting which tweets to cover, how to cover them, how much to cover them. And Kyle's point is they're really just not stepping up enough to do that job. I think there's a lesson here for people in the foreign policy world too, who may be putting too much emphasis on the president and his Twitter account. And I'm going to get back to that idea in a bit. But first, I think we should explore a little bit of history, which I'm going to tell from my perspective as a journalist and a press freedom advocate, just to help us understand how we've gotten to where we are today with the internet, with Twitter, and with its use, and sometimes its abuse by world leaders. So let's go back before Trump, before Obama, even before George Bush, to a time when the internet was still pretty fresh and new, and social media platforms didn't really exist yet, to a time before we'd even heard of Twitter. People in many walks of life in many countries around the world were thrilled by the possibilities of this new way of communicating online. I was at the Committee to Protect Journalists in the late 1990s, and the internet, to us, looked like the answer to our perennial question: how do we fight back against dictators and autocrats who have little or no respect for press freedom and free speech? The internet seemed like a pretty powerful answer to that. It was a communications tool that promised to be a great global democratizing force. It seemed to offer a new means of holding governments and politicians accountable. Sure, governments could still control or put pressure on traditional media, but citizens could take to the internet to post dissenting views or expose corruption or tell stories that were suppressed by the government. China was one of the first places where we at CPJ began to see that promise fulfilled. And you know, it was really pretty thrilling to watch until some of the internet posters were caught and sent to prison. And the Chinese government created its great firewall to control access to digital platforms. Today, there are still plenty of Chinese using the internet as a democratic bulletin board. Apparently today, as they've learned that their president is now maybe going to be president for life. And the press in China is freer than it used to be, say 20 years ago, at least when it comes to reporting on some subjects. But year after year, if you go to the Committee to Protect Journalists website, you'll see that China is always one of the leading jailers of journalists including those whose work is entirely online. Those who remain free learn to censor themselves to tiptoe around controversial topics, like the government's 1989 crackdown on the Tiananmen Square pro-democracy demonstrations. That's a subject you still can't talk about openly in China 30 years after it happened. So after a while, we kind of went from this, oh boy, this is going to be this wonderful democratizing tool, a great blow for press freedom, to sobering up and realizing that publishing online could end up being just as dangerous as putting your journalism into print or on the air. It was also kind of sobering to realize that we'd been naive in embracing this tool without recognizing that, of course, governments would embrace it too. Our own State Department, for example, began to use internet and social media platforms very vigorously for a new kind of e-diplomacy, particularly after Hillary Clinton became Secretary of State. Both the State Department and individual embassies around the world could reach out directly to people, often in their own languages, using Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms. An embassy might form discussion groups around topics that were not addressed in local media, because they were perhaps a little too sensitive in the local government's mind. Or the embassy might build a contact network of citizens and send them videos or stories about life in the U.S. A Brookings Institution report in 2012 said that these efforts by the State Department had become a de facto media empire. Much of that e-diplomacy effort that still goes on by the State Department and the embassies is really maybe kind of a targeted digital age variation on what Voice of America has done for decades. It's soft power diplomacy. And when Brookings analyzed this 5 years ago, its researchers noted that the State Department's Bureau of Public Affairs was always careful to vet its messaging before anyone pushed the post button. And if you followed the White House on social media in the Obama era, you had the sense that the same was true there. President Obama was a skillful social media communicator, but he was not an off-the-cuff tweeter. Now, enter Donald Trump. Long before he took office, we all became quite familiar with Trump's Twitter account and his habit of early morning tweeting, often using very attention-getting language, punctuation, many exclamation points, and provocative ideas. It didn't appear that anyone was vetting his messages before he sent them, even when they involved delicate points of foreign policy. In December 2016, for example, weeks before his inauguration, Trump tweeted one day that the U.S., quote, must greatly strengthen and expand its nuclear capability until such time as the world comes to its senses regarding nukes. Nuclear arms control experts went into shock. Trump's statement seemed to go against a decades-long bipartisan consensus on the need to reduce arsenals, not to expand them, and to do it through international cooperation. Now here's the incoming president saying the U.S. needs to unilaterally expand its nuclear capability? How? By how much? And when will we know that, in Trump's words, the world has come to its senses regarding nukes? So while the foreign policy community was parsing all of that, puzzling over it, one prominent Republican, Newt Gingrich, praised Trump's use of Twitter to go directly to the public with a major policy pronouncement. To be precise, Gingrich called it brilliant. And he added, quote, on the tweeting thing, we might as well get used to it. This is who he is. It's how he's going to operate. Boy, he was right about that. Shortly after that nuke tweet, Trump was back on Twitter complaining about the trade imbalance between the U.S. and China and criticizing China for not helping curb North Korea's nuclear ambitions. Xinhua, the official Chinese news agency, commented, an obsession with Twitter foreign policy is undesirable. Well, maybe so, but as Newt Gingrich said, get used to it. Last May, the president made clear he wasn't about to stop using Twitter for foreign policy pronouncements. Social media is the way to go, he said. I've got over 100 million people watching. Now, not all of Trump's actions or positions on foreign policy last year were announced first on Twitter, but his Twitter pronouncements, and probably most memorably his goading of Kim Jong-un, were always guaranteed to get attention and to rattle diplomats in the US and around the world. Hand-wringing about Trump, Twitter, and foreign policy seemed to peak a couple of months ago. The president retweeted videos from the leader of a notoriously Islamophobic party in UK, and that prompted British MPs to demand that either Trump give up his Twitter account or Twitter should shut him down before he wrote something that might be interpreted as a declaration of war. More Trump tweets followed in early January. Trump had fresh threats against North Korea. He issued a warning that the US might cut off aid to Palestinian refugees, and he warmly endorsed street protests in Iran that some experts said might help encourage actually a crackdown by hardliners on those people out in the streets. In bluster and tone, wrote the New York Times, Donald Trump has begun 2018 right where he left off. The Times was one of several mainstream outlets that wrote about the flurry of January tweets and the president's use of Twitter in what's always been seen as one of the most delicate areas of policymaking. New York Magazine called him a foreign policy wild card and a national security risk. In fact, many of those articles last month tended to conflate the platform with the policy. Experts quoted in them were very critical of the substance of Trump's positions, just as much as they were of the delivery mechanism. So the issue maybe wasn't so much his use of Twitter, but the about face that the president was often doing in terms of US foreign policy. For example, one of his most controversial recent foreign policy acts was the announcement that the US Embassy in Israel will move to Jerusalem. That news was not released first on social media, but by the president in a pre-written statement that he read, and it was recorded on video at the White House. Let me be clear, I'm not saying that we should be sanguine about Trump, Twitter, and foreign policy. Diplomacy has always relied on subtle language to keep negotiating avenues open. Closed-door diplomatic talks might be described as frank, meaning there was probably really vigorous argument behind those closed doors. But by not airing the argument publicly and avoiding, putting all the heated public rhetoric out there, or the heated rhetoric out there before the public, diplomats could hope to continue the process. It's kind of difficult to see where the negotiating process goes with North Korea when the US president derisively refers to Kim on Twitter as Rocket Man, and Kim shoots back by calling President Trump a dotard and a frightened dog. I did look up dotard one time, but I can't quite remember what it means. You sort of feel from the sound of it that it's not a compliment. The New York Times last month noted that while Trump's foreign policy tweets might sound inflammatory, he rarely was following up on his words, so far anyway. But rhetoric can definitely have consequences. And in my community of journalism and global press freedom, we're already seeing one big consequence of Donald Trump's Twitter rhetoric. You all know how he uses Twitter to denounce stuff that he doesn't like in the press, in mainstream media. He calls us purveyors of fake news. What you may not know is the degree to which this term has now been picked up and used by so many other leaders around the world. President Maduro in Venezuela, President Assad in Syria, the government of Rakhine State in Myanmar, where more than 600,000 Rohingya have fled in recent months amid allegations of a military crackdown. The New York Times reported that a local Rakhine official, when asked about this, said, "There's no such thing as Rohingya, that's fake news." President Assad of Syria used the term to deny allegations by Amnesty International that thousands had died in a Syrian military prison. You can forge anything these days, Assad said. We are living in a fake news era. And just last week, President Duterte in the Philippines used the same term in his ongoing battle with an independent news site called Rappler. It's a site that regularly fact-checks the president's statements and recently reported corruption allegations against one of his closest aides. Duterte, of course, would like to ban Rappler, so he dismissed it as a purveyor of fake news. Now, journalists in those countries and others can tell you that these are very concrete examples of what it means when Donald Trump tweets about fake news. Other consequences may be less obvious, but no less important. That's the argument of many in foreign policy circles in any case, like Council on Foreign Relations President Richard Haass. In an interview with NPR last month, Haass acknowledged that some dismissed Trump's tweets as, he's just letting off steam, he's playing to his political base, doesn't really mean that much. Maybe so, said Haass, but the words of the president are the most valuable currency the U.S. has in some ways. I think Haass's analysis is well worth listening to. He worked in the administration of the first President Bush, and he says that there, as in probably all White Houses before Donald Trump, announcements were carefully scrubbed, as he put it, by staff before they were issued. In other words, think before you push that button. Among the questions the staff would ask before the button was pushed or the statement was issued are, is this likely to advance American interests? Will this make it more or less difficult for us to get to where we want to get to? In Trump's case, Haass argues, that the president's tweets often work against the goals of his own administration, and that introduces uncertainty for Americans and for other countries and leaders around the world. Richard Haass said, maybe I'm old school here, but I want things to be calm. I like things to be predictable. I don't understand why the United States would want to wake up every morning and disrupt international relations when, for the most part, we've been well served by what's gone on in the world for the last 70 years. Now, whatever your foreign policy views may be, you too probably would like for things to be calm or at least more predictable than they are today. But let me go back to Newt Gingrich's December 2016 advice when it comes to Donald Trump, Twitter, and foreign policy. Get used to a lot of surprises. Thank you all very much. I'd be very happy to answer any questions that anybody has about this or anything else. Sorry, can you speak that way?
Given that the understanding that other people have written these books, which are part of the deal and transaction, is this tweet, he's generating this tweet himself, or he has people around him who generate it for him and he's not?
So that's a good and kind of unanswerable question, or at least for me. I don't know if you've heard, but he's asking, do we think that Donald Trump is actually writing all of those tweets, or are there people around him who are at least helping out, or maybe sending out some of the tweets? This is an era when some of the journalists covering the White House seem to have terrific sources on the inside, and I've never seen a suggestion that somebody else was up at 5 o'clock in the morning sending those tweets or even looking at them. I think we're pretty much getting him. But, I'm basing that on what I read. I have no particular insider knowledge.
I was with my 13-year-old grandson a few weeks ago, And I asked him, well, now that he has a phone and all, I said, like, your Facebook page. And he said, oh, we don't do Facebook. We're doing something called Snapchat or something. And are these platforms changing rapidly, that they're going to be going, you know, either the technology is changing or the kids say, well, that's for old folks. We're into this now.
The answer is yes. I think, oh, I'm sorry. So the question is, was it your 13-year-old grandson?
Yes.
Said, oh, you know, Facebook's kind of passé, you know, we're all on Snapchat. So the question is, are these technologies changing all the time? And the answer is yes, so the apps are changing. You know, WhatsApp is a thing, and you know what, they don't just change here, they change around the world. I think it's Colombia where everybody communicates on WhatsApp. You know, I've never even seen WhatsApp myself. Twitter, I know, was like the thing that you used if you were in Saudi Arabia to communicate with other people. So what's popular here is not necessarily what's popular in some other country that you're going to, which is something that we teach our students who are going to go abroad, find out what people are using in that country. But yeah, I think we're going to, you know, continue seeing new platforms all the time. I'm sure there are, you know, many being developed and tested, and who knows which one is going to. I actually heard that Snapchat was sort of falling out of favor, but it was definitely hot for a while. And it's way too much for me to talk about. Yes.
I find it hard to, I have a very loud voice. I find it hard to believe that there were teenagers in Macedonia that knew so much about our election, knew who the candidates were, and why they would go for Trump and Bernie Sanders rather than somebody else. So I'm very cynical about what's going on, and I don't really believe that it was just these teenage kids who did it. Somehow I think they're getting stuff from Russia or someplace to what to put on.
Okay, so the point was, it's kind of hard to believe that these teenagers in Macedonia were really savvy enough to, you know, figure out what to post. You know, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of our politicians and our political system. Perhaps there's a connection to Russia or someone else. You know, I don't think they have they described, you know, testing out different messages, like about Bernie Sanders, and all they cared about was getting the traffic because they wanted the money.
But the question is, how do they know all of these candidates? And what about all the other people that Trump was running against in the primary?
The internet. The world knows about our, certainly they knew about our 2016 election.
They understood the policy of Bernie Sanders. They understood more, and I think they were getting some tutoring someplace. I don't think it's as simple as a bunch of teenagers doing this over the world.
That could be, but they were not, remember, they weren't sitting down and writing these stories themselves. They were just lifting them from other people, from far-right sites. Yeah, I mean, yes, I see your point. If they were the ones who were sitting there, how do we write some disinformation about Hillary, you know, and just pull it out of the air? I don't think they would have had the wherewithal to do that. Somebody else was doing it. They were just figuring out a way to monetize it, basically.
And there's questions on the other side.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes. Hi. Thank you very much to give us the insight. I'm a long-term member of the Foreign Affairs Forum, and I think it's not just the limited scope of this impact, because in my younger days, actually, I was deeply involved with the digital network revolution. At a very early stage, I already recognized the difference, fundamental difference between the classical communication system, the capability and limitation, and also this internet. It's an open system. It's the identity is very difficult to determine who's the real source. So you can have fake source. So you have attribution issues. And also because the issue you brought up is very important about international, the power structure and stability. How do you, what do you see the things to manage this kind of instant communication with open sources and without hierarchical control or domain or filtering? What's your point? What's your view?
Oh, okay, so the question is, or the point is about the internet, that it is a very open system. It's hard to detect sources. It's easy for false sources to put out a lot of information, as we all now know very well. We read about it every day. It's hard to figure out, where the information is coming from, where to attribute it, what do we do about all that, right? If I had the answer to that, I'd probably be making a lot of money off of that. I think that, it's been, we've been a little slow to recognize, just how vulnerable it is. I've talked about one of my colleagues, Emily Bell, at Columbia Journalism School, who's been writing for some time and has vastly more expertise on this than I do, but she's really kind of hammered the platforms, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and said, you guys say we're agnostic. We're just a platform out there. We're not a publisher. And, she says, yes, you are. You need to take responsibility for what's out there. And I think that is, that's a genuine debate that's going on right now. But how do you do that? The volume of material, the volume of stuff put out by bots all the time is, makes some people kind of throw up their hands and say, we can't manage this. Well, I think they're going to have to figure out a way to do it. And the one thing that makes me hopeful is that there is so much debate about it now and so much criticism of the platforms. You have to resolve this, or you have to figure out a way to deal with it. But I don't know what that way is going to be.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yes.
Do you see any correlation between Citizens United and the polarization of the media?
Okay, the question is, do I see a correlation between Citizens United and the polarization of the media? Probably. I think when you say the polarization of the media, I think we've had an explosion of media. And so much of the newer media is extremely partisan. Of course, people say mainstream media, they're all liberal. Well, many of them, most of them probably are, but there are standards, the kinds of things that we teach at journalism school. You need to be fair. You need to verify your information. You need to be able to show where you got it, and and really try to get at what is the truth of the matter. There's a lot of media out there that does not abide by standards like that. How they're connected? Do you think there's a correlation there? This is not something that I've really thought about.
I don't know. It'd be interesting to do some research on it.
Yeah. There's certainly, so much more partisanship because, this is another consequence or byproduct of the digital age that we didn't really think about that much at the beginning. That, at first it was kind of exciting. Anybody can be a journalist. Anybody can be a publisher. Okay, great. But, the journalism that I grew up with and worked in for decades, there were standards, there were editors. You had to answer to them. You had to answer to your audience. And now when everybody's a publisher, that's gone by the wayside for a lot of the newer sites. Yes?
Most people in this country are outraged that by the Russians meddling in our election, including me. But you think about it, 40, 50 years ago, the United States was meddling in Central America and South American elections in various countries. And my question is, how did they do it? There was no internet. There really nothing down there. There was no television. There was radio. How did they do it?
So the question is, you know, long before we talked about the Russians meddling in our elections, the U.S. definitely has a history of meddling in other elections. I don't know a lot of the detail about, you know, Central America and what was done. Money was used, but, you know, I don't know about, you know, how communications operated. But, you know, every time there is something like, you know, the Maidan uprising in Ukraine a few years ago, the U.S. was accused of meddling there. And there definitely are, you know, cases where I would say, yes, the U.S. was meddling. In a place like Ukraine, I think the U.S. was saying, this is a democratic movement against an autocratic leader. We want to support that. But it's very easy for somebody like Vladimir Putin to look at that and say, yeah, you're meddling. So I think there's kind of a fine line of what's, you know, what constitutes meddling and what constitutes, you know, we believe in democracy, we want to promote democracy. What's democracy promotion, what's meddling?
There's a double standard going on.
Yes. That has certainly been raised many times in this discussion about what Russia did or did not do in the election. And the last row there.
Yeah, I'm wondering, you know, each generation has a level of innovation, you know, that kind of supersedes what previous generations have kind of brought to bear in any industry and kind of human endeavor. And I'm wondering if you have any insights or can share any thoughts about how what this president has brought to, you know, this practice of communication, kind of in terms of, you know, let's call it innovation, how it might compare to his predecessors. And, you know, are there any kind of notable kind of instances where someone really had kind of mastered, you know, a particular channel or form of communication in a way that maybe historically we'll look back and say, this guy kind of did it. And then also, if you had anything, you know, if you have any thoughts on, you know, what comes next? You know, it seems like the toothpaste, as much as we might like to say, let's get Twitter under control, Facebook, I think, you know, I think if there's any lesson we learn from technology and innovation, the toothpaste is out of the tube. And I think, you know, this is, it's not, you know, one can only imagine what's going to come next. So I wonder if you've given any thought, or your colleagues have given any thought to what this guy's predecessor might have to deal with, or might kind of bring to, you know, the role going forward.
You know, what his successor will do. Did everybody hear that?
Yeah.
No, okay. So the question is about, you know, what sort of innovations has Trump brought in communications that, you know, are maybe going to stick with us or, you know, have an impact on whoever comes along next. And, you know, sadly, I worry about what's happened to political discourse that is already, you know, becoming much more belligerent, I think, and much more partisan, and he's only exacerbated that. And you know, there are times when I wonder, so what will it be like whenever there's another president who's not going to be like Donald Trump, most likely? Does that get rolled back? Probably not, or at least not rolled back to the way things were before. And that's pretty disturbing, because as we can see that, you know, again, rhetoric, it may be rhetoric rather than action, but there are consequences to it. And I think one of the consequences is the stalemate that we see in Washington right now, and Congress's inability to come together on really anything. We were seeing that in the Obama years, but it just seems like we have that in spades now. You know, I don't have a crystal ball to know who's going to be next or you know what they'll stand for, but think it's something they're really gonna have to wrestle with. I could see somebody coming in and saying, you know, okay, that was, that was a tough time with that president. There was a lot of coarseness in the discourse, there was a lot of attacking, and I'm the new man or woman in office, and I want to do things differently. But that's one person, and you've got all of Congress, you've got state legislatures. I think it's really had quite an impact. And again, not just in this country, but around the world, other leaders saying, I'm going to talk like that too. Yes.
May I suggest another dimension to this whole social media platform? I've just been through both hurricanes in Puerto Rico, when all of the television went out, all of the phones went out, there was no news, there was no way that people could communicate, either the government with the people or the people among the people. And the only thing that worked intermittently were the cell phones with the platforms, Snapchat, and particularly actually WhatsApp, which we literally survived by for weeks on end. And it was the only way that we could communicate at all. And in many of the conflict situations in the countries, the young people, in fact, now, and I'm sure you know more about this than I do, are actually communicating that way because there's nothing else. And I wonder if, to take up from what you just said, we're actually learning something completely new, that Trump is doing us a favor by putting this all up there, this balloon, if you like, and letting us see and get ready and sort of orchestrate not only our arguments, but our practices, in order to be able to cope with disaster in different ways and ongoing events in different ways. I don't know what you think about that.
So that's fascinating to know that in the wake of hurricane in Puerto Rico, that Snapchat and WhatsApp became the means of communication because everything else was down or destroyed. And has Trump sort of given that a boost, I guess you would say? I think that would have happened with or without him. I mean, that's one of the good stories about the digital age, about our ability to communicate in this way. And I think that it's Trump didn't really have anything to do with that. That was people figuring out we need information. We need to be able to get information out to isolated people. And how can we do that? Here's an app on the phone that they may have.
But to Richard Haas's contempt, if you like, if I don't use too strong a word, only Trump has done it at that level.
Only Trump has done it at that level. You mean at the level of the office that he holds?
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, I mean, Barack Obama used social media as well, but you did have the sense, I mean, that question of who's actually writing the tweets. I don't know that Obama wrote all of everything that he ever posted. And I'm betting that he consulted somebody on most of it, if not all of it. So yeah, in that sense, Trump is up there by himself. But, it's one person. This is me. I'm out there. I'm putting it all out there. But I don't really see how that, influences a situation like Puerto Rico, where it's not just one person, it was probably many people communicating, trying to gather information and figure out where do we need to send help. I don't know. I mean, how do you see the connection there?
I see it as an experiment, as a human experiment. I see it as an innovative lab, if you like, innovation lab experiment, one of millions, or several 100,000, I dare say, that are going on today in today's world. That things are changing so fast, and that we don't have textbooks written in the time to be able to deal with these things. So university professors, and I'm actually from Sebring, so I don't think anybody could honestly keep up. I see huge reforms in higher education ahead, simply because look at the kids in Parkland. Look at the lessons they've taught us.
Yeah.
I mean, it's incredible. This is happening so fast
Mhm.
that we professors, I think, have got to either, wake up to something completely new, or we've got to move over. Sorry, I'm migrating.
No, I was talking with Jonathan earlier about, me as a professor, I didn't use these tools when I was a reporter. I can't teach that. There are other people at the school who do, and we bring in lots of people. I can still teach, traditional journalism and the ethics and standards and, the need for verification and, basically how to do your job responsibly and fairly as a reporter. And I hope that never goes away. But, the technical skills, and not just the technical, how do you do this, but then what do I do with that? Yeah, that's something that I think our students are going to be teaching us. They are already, as you say, Parkline does. Yes?
Just from a historical perspective, I'd like to bring two things up. I think one of the masters of communication, which is what we're really talking about, was Franklin Roosevelt in the 1933, 34, with the use of radio, which was the first broadcast on a national, international scale, with his fireside chats in some very serious times for our country and the world. I think that was a milestone of communication that, in a certain sense, is similar or parallel to what's going on today. Also, in the beginning of the 60s, I think Jack Kennedy's use of television was another kind of a step forward into utilizing media to communicate in what he had to. My overall point, I think, is that we survived those important and, using the radio, to me, in a certain sense, might be as big as using the internet, because by this time we have utilized all these media over time, so we've kind of gotten used to, oh, this is the next step forward, in the same way as the cell phone has inaugurated itself into our lives. So it seems to me that whatever comes from the use of Twitter and these, we will survive them. It's just a question of getting used to it and kind of rolling with the punches. We have someone in office today who's, may not be here very long, and so will that whole kind of thing die rather rapidly?
Good question, and a good reminder that we have been through periods in the past where, a new means of communication came in, radio with FDR, TV with JFK, and the politicians were able to use that, to get a message out. The big difference I see today is that there are so many different messages out there competing for our attention. It's not like I wasn't around for the fireside chats, but you see those pictures of the whole family, sitting by the radio listening. And certainly TV, when I was growing up, network TV, that was it. There were 3 channels. You watched one of them, they had 90 million people watching every night. Their audience is still big by, some standards, but it's under 30 million and continues to shrink. But nobody else has that, that big, draw that audience, except maybe Trump's Twitter account, I don't know. But Yeah, that's the big difference, and that's what makes me perhaps a little more pessimistic than you are, that we're gonna get through this and everything will be fine. But I hope you're right. Yes?
Don't you think, with regard to foreign policy, that the Trump tweets are really essentially a short-term problem, in as much as if words are the coinage of communication, which they are, he's actually debased his own coinage. So in time, people will ignore him. I personally ignore everything he says, but that's because I don't want to waste my time. But I think the more serious long-term thing is that what he's done, or what he hasn't done, is emasculated the State Department, where there are many ambassadorships that are not fulfilled. And foreign countries don't know what our foreign policy is. We have avoided foreign policy. If you ask, what is Trump's foreign policy, or what is the US foreign policy, it's a great mystery novel.
Well, I think you're right, that, the much more damaging, or at least immediately damaging stuff is the failure to fill all these jobs at the State Department. Leave them empty, leave governments, puzzling over what is our policy. But again, rhetoric can have an impact too, and you may not be looking or listening to about his tweets anymore, but some people are. And I think, potentially the long-term damage is just the coarsening of discourse, within this country, but also, among leaders, world leaders. We've had remarkable situations of world leaders calling each other names, usually with Trump starting it, or somebody reacting to something that Trump did. Is that going to go away when he goes away? I don't know. I would hope it would, but I don't think there's any assurance that it will.
Well, that's up to world leaders being a little more adult than they currently are.
You could probably say that at many points in history. Yes.
In any message, there is a sender and there is a receiver. And I think that we should focus more on educating the receiver. Yes. The sender has an easy way these days because technology allows them an audience. Okay? Professional journalists should fill the vacuum and educate the receiver. What you were just saying, where is this information coming from? Making sense? Is it realistic? Is it proven? Rather than having people accept whatever they're fed without any criticism. By the way, I don't have a Facebook account or any social account. For that reason, I don't trust anyone.
But there's the problem with what you're asking. You're saying, professional journalists should be educating the receiver. Okay, but the receiver has to be willing to trust. And first of all, the receiver has to find that mainstream journalism. And things have been so disrupted. We all used to get a newspaper delivered to our doorstep, or listen to National Public Radio in the morning, or watch one of those 3 network channels, for news at night. And now there's so many more choices. Our kids and our grandkids are not going to subscribe to the paper. When I ask my journalism students, where do you get your news? The answer is Facebook, Twitter. Which of course, Facebook isn't writing news stories and Twitter isn't writing news stories. They're getting news stories on that platform. But, we all know how different that is from the way probably most of the people here grew up consuming news. So the news consumption patterns have been disrupted, and that, I think, makes it harder to do what you're saying needs to be done. I totally agree with you, but I think it's a wider responsibility than just journalists, you know. It's parents, it's teachers, it's everybody needs to talk about, you know, what makes some places trustworthy, where do you find trustworthy sources of information, how do you tell that they're trustworthy, yeah.
And that's why the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Post and so on should have their Twitter account and fill the whole space and sign every tweet. Because that way they demonstrate that they are able to bring news that have a base and a substance.
I think they're all of the outlets that you mentioned are very, very active on Twitter, on Facebook, on all of the Snapchat, name a platform. Yes, in the back.
So I regularly use social media, and I don't think it's all bad, but I do feel that Trump violated Twitter's terms of service, and they kept him online, and they've shut down other voices much less. I'm curious, what's your position on the rollback of net neutrality and what Trump is trying to do with people bringing their voices out, and journalism and publication of social media?
I feel like there are a couple of different things there. One is, should Trump be banned from Twitter? I think there are petitions calling for that. You know, imagine if Twitter actually throws the president. It's a very delicate situation. Net neutrality, I think we're all appalled. You know, who is in favor of what the FCC did except for the companies that will profit from it? And I think that's, you know, one of the things about this administration is so many things are being done that first of all, don't get nearly enough attention, in part because of all the coverage of the tweets. You know, other news is not examined perhaps in the same depth that it should. You know, I don't know what percentage of Americans would support doing away with net neutrality, but it's got to be really small. I think, you know, what's maybe hopeful is that local governments are saying, some states, I think Montana actually is one of the states that has said, you know, we need net neutrality. I don't know anything about how that functions, whether you can actually do that within one state, you know, and if your neighboring states are not doing it. But it's a problem, it really is. Yes?
Have you detected any serious consideration of changing the advertising model of financing the internet that you described? And could the widespread use of ad blockers lead to a change?
Well, I think that, you know, the news media are still struggling with what is the economic model going to be now that there's no classified advertising in newspapers.
I mean the model that prompts people to put junk on just to get people to sign into it.
You mean using ad blockers to try to destroy what the Macedonian teenagers were doing? Or?
Will it lead to destruction, or is there a discussion of totally changing the way that financing is done to prevent things like that?
I don't know that, but I do know, as we were speaking earlier, that there's a lot of discussion about how are we going to grapple with this. So I think, you know, everything is on the table. How practical that is, how willing, you know, platforms would be to do that, to allow that, I don't know. But I think, you know, we've really, it feels like we're reaching a crisis point. And so all of these things really need to be discussed.
A couple more questions.
Okay, sure.
In terms of fake news, if the leadership of our country is telling us that unless this message complies with what I want to hear, it's fake news, how long can the American public absorb this, and could that just become a norm if we're not careful?
Yeah, so Yeah, so the question is, how long can the country absorb, hearing the president say, that's fake news, over and over and over again? I think that's, what Trump is counting on, is if I say it enough, more people will start to believe it. This gets back to, media literacy and trying to make sure that people know how to find trustworthy sources, and that's where they go, and don't go to the people who are actually doing fake news. It's a challenge. It's a real battle, and I don't know how it's going to come out. I think it's kind of scary. There was Marty Behrman, the editor of the Washington Post, just gave a talk, I think, at the Reuters Institute very recently. It's worth looking up online. He was more worried than I wish he were. I mean, just given where he is, and how much he knows, I think we don't know how it's all going to turn out and what that impact ultimately will be. I think, there were so many points in the campaign and, in the early days after Trump was elected, when people would say, Kyle Pope wrote about this in the CJR article, people would say, well, this is just so outrageous that this will be the end of him, and it wasn't. And, with fake news, you'd like to think, well, people recognize that he's just labeling anything he doesn't like fake news, or anything that's critical of him is automatically fake news. But, he keeps using it, and what that long-term impact will be, I don't know. Yes?
We spend a lot of time talking about the technology. We talk about who's putting news on the line, whether it's the president or other people. We talk about how to educate people about fake news. Isn't there something more fundamental, that people don't care that it's fake, or they don't think of it that way? People are just looking for information that supports their current beliefs and aren't willing to have an open debate about what's right and not?
There's certainly some experts who would make that argument, and some of it, I think, is based on research. I'm not going to believe that, though, because I think that's just way too depressing a thought.
The news memo, an encounter memo from the Democrats, forget what side you're on. If you just read the memos, it's pretty intuitive what's happening, and yet people don't believe it.
Yeah.
And because maybe they don't want to believe it, or they're happy to support their opinion.
Yeah. Well, I think, the memos, here's an example of where the partisanship in Congress has just gotten completely out of control. And I was at an event a couple of days ago where we were talking about investigative journalism, and sort of when did, the impact of Watergate, the impact of Vietnam on journalists, and, sort of becoming tougher and, doing more accountability journalism. And somebody said, well, also back in the 70s, Congress was a good investigator. There were the church committee hearings. I covered Congress in the 70s and early 80s, and everything. There were hearings on everything, and yeah, there was partisanship, but there was, some sense of, well, we are here to try to solve some problems, and let's have a hearing, and people would come and testify, and there would be a real, a cordial airing of issues and a cordial airing of disagreements, and that's completely disappeared. The tax bill, there were no hearings. The repeal Obamacare, there were no hearings about any of that. And, so you'd get things like the Congressional Budget Office putting out a report saying, here's what the impact will be. But it was just like a little blip of a story, and you'd read it and say, wait, this is important. So it's not just media, but all, our institutions are really, I don't want to say failing, challenged, that's a good word, thank you. Yes?
I wonder to what extent the local state has to take some responsibility now for the situation we're in. I know this will sound a little goofy, but first of all, I consider myself to be an independent. I voted for Democrats, Republicans, Tim Russert might have been kind of the last honest broker in the media before the media all decided to kind of man the barricades and take sides. And I wonder to what extent, you feel it might be appropriate, or colleagues feel it might be appropriate, for some level of reformation in journalism, for you guys to start looking at yourselves and wondering, not how effectively you can man the barricades, but how you could become a catalyst to bring about some other level of change that we probably all feel, we believe is necessary, and could kind of help shift us in a different direction now.
Well, I think we actually talk kind of obsessively about that. If you go to the Columbia Journalism Review site, cjr.org, the Kyle Pope article that I mentioned is there. Every day, tons of sort of self-examination, self-criticism, which is not to say that we're wonderful and we get things right all the time, because we do make plenty of mistakes. I get pretty upset watching cable TV news. To me, what you're saying, I would very much agree with you when it comes to that area of mainstream media. I don't know what they're doing. I don't get it anymore. There's one story every day, and they bring on, somebody over here and somebody over here, and they, fight. It's almost like they're having a food fight or something. What does that accomplish? It accomplishes nothing.
Entertainment.
It is entertainment, yes. And yet, the cable channels get a lot more attention than they should, considering their audience size. And I don't remember what the numbers are, but they're like, compared to the nightly news, it's pretty insignificant. I don't watch the nightly news anymore, though, either, which I think would be a lot more responsible. Certainly not, this kind of, let's let a far right and a far left person fight it out here. That's not what they do. That's not their tradition. That wasn't Walter Cronkite's tradition. It wasn't Tim Russert's tradition. But it's, it's all about audience, and I guess the cable channels have decided this is where we're going to get our audience because it is entertaining. And that's wrong. That's just flat wrong. I think you'd find many people in journalism who would say that, would agree with that, but how do you go about changing it?
Not a very optimistic assessment, it sounds like.
I think there are plenty of solid, trustworthy, fair places that you can go to for news and analysis, and please do so. Turn off the cable news if it's if they're doing a bad job. That isn't going to turn them around, but it's all about, for us, it's all about being well informed and being properly informed and truthfully informed.